A few years back, me and a few very close friends went on a camping trip. We'd been planning it for literally like a year, and we were super excited to leave behind the hustle and bustle of the big city and immerse ourselves in the raw beauty of nature. And there were 5 of us. Myself, Rachel, a 23-year-old female, Rob, Jenna, Jay, and Dave. And having spent all of our high school years together, we were a close-knit group, and for me personally, the trip seemed like it was going to be the highlight of our year. But I don't think I've ever been more wrong. Our packs were hanging low with the weight of our supplies, but our spirits were high as we set out from the trailhead. The weather was fine, and we moved at a steady pace as the trail wound through the woods, climbing pretty gently at first and then dripping into these shallow ravines before rising back up again. We laughed and joked as we went, and it felt good to be out there, away from the screens and schedules with nothing but each other and the promise of a campfire cookout ahead. By late afternoon, we'd covered a good distance, and since we weren't planning on setting up camp for another couple of hours, we decided to stop for a break in a small clearing nestled beneath this low rise. And the spot felt sheltered, almost cozy, so we dropped our packs and sprawled out on the ground, pulling out sandwiches and water bottles. Apart from the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird, the forest was really quiet, and it was like this moment of stillness that made me feel like we were in a special place, and at a special time. But it turns out that I was right, just for all the wrong reasons. And after a few minutes, Dave stood up, brushed off his jeans, and then walked off into this corner of trees after saying that he had to take a leak. We barely glanced his way, too busy eating and stretching out our sore muscles. Now the seconds ticked by, and we talked a little among ourselves until this sudden and terrible sound just absolutely shattered the calm. It was a scream, raw and guttural, and it ripped through the air like a chainsaw in our ears. It was Dave, and it wasn't just a cry of surprise or pain. It was something very primal, something that reached into the deepest part of your brain and flipped every switch to absolute panic. We all scrambled to our feet and ran toward the sound, crashing through the brush as branches were snagging on our clothes, and we found Dave, 30 yards away, crumpled on the ground, hands clawing at his leg. Clamped around it was an old bear trap. Its rusted jaws snapped shut around his ankle. His screams had turned to gasps, and his face was pale and slick with sweat as he writhed in agony. Blood pooled beneath his leg, soaking into the dirt, and the sight of the jagged metal biting into his flesh made my stomach absolutely turn. Jenna dropped to her knees beside him, saying, oh God," with her hands flat and trembling like she didn't know what to do with them. And Rob swore under his breath, just pacing in a tight circle while Jay just stood frozen, staring at it. And I forced myself to look closer. And this trap looked ancient, with its old rusted chain anchored to a stake buried deep in the ground, and it must have been abandoned years ago, just left to rot there, until Dave's foot had found it. All of a sudden, Jay snapped out of his daze and knelt down beside Jenna. I've seen this before, he said. Old traps like this, there's a release mechanism. You just need to find it. And he ran his hand along the trap's edges. His fingers seemed to be trembling as Dave tried to stifle his whimpers, and his breathing was coming in these short, sharp bursts by then, and his blood was staining Jay's hands as he worked. And after what felt like an eternity, Jay finally found it. A rusted lever hidden beneath a layer of dirt. Hold him steady, he told us. Rob and I grabbed Dave's shoulders, pinning him down as he thrashed. Jenna gripped his hand, saying some reassurances that I'm not sure he could even hear, and Jay pressed down on the lever with both hands. The trap resisted for a moment, and then it gave way. Its jaws then sprang apart, and Dave screamed again as the pressure released, his leg free but badly hurt. I looked, and quickly wished that I hadn't. The flesh was torn wide open, and the bone was visible beneath the mesh of mangled meat. We carried Dave back to the clearing as his screams just went down to whimpers, and Jenna dug through her pack and pulled out a first aid kit, wrapping his legs in bandages that soaked through almost instantly. Rob pulled out a pistol from his bag. He said he had it just in case. He held it low, scanning the trees as we planned our next move. The campsite plan was quickly abandoned, obviously. Dave needed a hospital, and we were less than a day's hike from the car. We left most of our gear behind, taking only what we needed to move fast, and then headed out. Jay and I supported Dave with his arms slung over our shoulders. Jenna carried the first aid kit, and Dave took point with a gun as he led us back along the trail. The woods felt very different now. The peace was replaced by absolute terror. It had been transformed from this paradise into a living hell so fast that it was making my head spin. We made decent progress at first, with the adrenaline pushing us forward, and Dave was getting paler, his head lolling against my shoulder as he begged us to slow down, and the bandages were just completely covered in blood. It dripped onto the trail behind us, leaving a trail of its own. And we knew it was hurting him, but we had no choice but to keep going. And then just when we thought that things could not get any worse, they did. We were halfway to the car when it happened. This sharp crack split the air, and something whizzed past my head, close enough that I felt the rush of it. It was a gunshot, and it wasn't Rob. Someone yelled out something as we hit the ground, dragging Dave behind a fallen log. Another shot rang out, and I swear it splintered the bark above us before Rob started to fire back randomly towards what the sound had come from. He yelled at us to run, waving us on so Jay and I hauled Dave up, stumbling as we moved with Jenna keeping close behind. Rob kept shooting, trying to cover us as we ran. He was so brave, but I'll never forget how wide-eyed and terrified he looked as he kept peeking out from behind a tree, firing. The woods completely erupted into chaos. Shots came sporadically. Some felt like they were close, some distant, and the echoes were bouncing off the trees until we couldn't tell where anything was coming from anymore. We ran blindly. Branches were whipping us in the face as we were almost tripping with every step. Dave had lost a lot of blood so far, but he must have been surging with adrenaline, hopping like a man possessed as we ran alongside him to give him balance. Rob caught up, saying keep going, and he was gasping as he was reloading another magazine. My lungs burned and my legs screamed, but fear kept me moving, the trees thinning out as we neared the trailhead. I could see the faint outline of the car when the final shot cracked behind us, and then there was silence. We didn't stop to check, and we didn't look back. We reached the car, piling Dave into the back seat as his blood smeared all over the inside, and Jenna climbed in beside him, pressing fresh bandages to his leg while Jay took the wheel. Rob kept his pistol ready, scanning the tree line as I slammed the passenger door shut. Our engine turned on and we peeled out of there, the road twisting through the forest as Dave groaned and was still alive, but it felt like barely. Cell signal was non-existent, so we aimed for the nearest town 30 miles away, and that drive was just a blur. We talked to Dave to try and keep him awake, and he stayed responsive, but there was still a little voice in my head that I had to actively silence that kept telling me that he was going to die. We reached the hospital just after nightfall, screeching into the emergency room as doctors and nurses swarmed us. They took David away on a stretcher before we collapsed in the waiting room, exhausted and shaken, our clothes completely stained with blood and dirt. And hours later, a doctor came out. Dave wasn't going to die, she said, but his leg was a complete mess. He'd need surgery, maybe more than one, and there was a chance that he might never walk the same again. The police came next, 2 officers in uniforms who took our statements. We told them everything, from the trap to the gunfire, and they listened, making notes, and then asked about the shooter, but we had nothing to offer. We didn't see him at all, let alone his face, and we hadn't interacted with anyone either, so it wasn't like we could point the cops in the right direction of someone we'd pissed off. Someone had just come out of nowhere and started shooting. The cops promised to investigate, to check the woods for evidence, but their tone didn't suggest that they'd be particularly helpful. They said they'd look into it, and Dave's mom and dad called them many more times to ask for updates, but the investigation never went anywhere and the shooter's identity remains a mystery. But we never went back into those woods, obviously. The stuff that we left behind stayed there, like a little monument to the day that our adventure turned into a living nightmare. Dave recovered, and although he has a nasty scar, his rehabilitation went really well, and now you'd never guess that he almost lost his leg one time. We tried to talk about it a couple of times, late at night over some drinks, and the words always just left us, and the questions kind of just lingered. Who set the trap? And who fired those shots? But since we knew that we'd never get any answers to any of that, it's just sort of felt like speculating. It felt pointless. And none of us have ever really hiked since then either. The woods just don't feel inviting anymore, and the sound of Dave's screams still echo in my head sometimes. We survived, but something broke that day that won't heal like David's leg did, and I know for certain that he feels exactly the same way. I'm a former U.S. Marshal, and I'm currently writing my autobiography, and I'd like to share a dramatization of what might be the most memorable chapter of my career. I'm not an experienced writer by any means, so this may not meet the standards that you're used to, but if you find it in any way compelling and wish to use it in the video, then the confidence that'll give me is the only compensation I require. You see, it all started late one Sunday evening back in October of 1986. I was sitting at home watching some highlights on TV when the phone began to ring, and since no one called past 10 p.m. unless it was important, I slid over on the couch and picked it up. It was my SD, or supervisory deputy, and all he told me was, "Be at the federal courthouse, 8 a.m. sharp. You got a task force briefing." I've been a deputy U.S. Marshal out of the Eastern Washington District for coming up on 4 years by that point. Long enough to know that when something big was brewing, that's exactly how it went down. No info on the target, no info on their location, just a date and time for the briefing. And after hearing the word task force, I had a reasonably good idea we'd be hunting a priority fugitive. But what I didn't know was that bringing him in would result in one of the strangest and most unsettling incidents of my entire career. The next morning, I drove over to the Spokane County Courthouse where I met my SD at the door. He directed me to a conference room on the second floor, and when I stepped inside, there was already half a dozen guys in there wearing a mix of suits, polos, and duty rigs. It was mostly my fellow marshals at first, but I also recognized an FBI special agent from the local field office. And then before the clock ticked over to 8 a.m., the room filled up with half a dozen more marshals out of the Seattle office, a handful of state troopers, and a pair of detectives from the Spokane PD. After a couple of more minutes, the room began buzzing with small talk and introductions as the caffeine started to kick in. But the chatter ceased immediately when the chief deputy marshal for the district walked in, flanked by an assistant U.S. attorney. The chief deputy marshal walked up to the speaker's stand, set down his coffee, and then got straight down to business. "All right, listen up. We got a high-priority apprehension on our hands, and this could be a tough one." He consulted his notes and then continued. "Fugitive's name is Raymond Ridgway. He's 42 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with a lean build, red hair, and dark brown eyes. Notable markings include burn scars to the palms of his hands and multiple tattoos, particular on his hands and fingers. He's wanted on 4 counts of homicide, 2 in Idaho, 2 in Oregon, and then 2 counts of murder of a federal officer after he ambushed those 2 FBI agents last year." The chief paused, consulting his notes again as a murmur of apprehension swept around the room. "All reports suggest Ridgway will be armed, and will have no qualms pulling the trigger on anyone wearing a badge. But do not mistake that man's reputation. He's an animal, but he's as intelligent and cunning as he is unstable, and each of you would do very well to remember that when the time comes to bring him in." The marshals began swapping nervous looks as the chief paused again, and the assistant U.S. attorney stepped forward with a stack of folders, passing them out as the chief continued. "Intel puts Ridgway in the Pasayten Wilderness, up near the Canadian border. It's a needle in a haystack situation, but we've managed to narrow things down a little. After a tip from a hunter, the FBI flew a plane over the forest, and the best guess from their analysts is that he's holed up on the Osceola Peak." After instructing someone to dim the lights, the chief flicked a switch on an old overhead projector, and in an instant, the wall behind him lit up with a topographical map of the Pasayten Wilderness. "This is our target zone," the chief said, pointing towards Osceola Peak, which had been circled in red. "There's a shelf of even ground a few hundred meters from the summit. It's tough to access, there's more than enough cover to keep him hidden, and we think he's sheltering the largest of the 3 caves up there, most probably alone, but he's had time to dig in. Elevation's around 8,500 feet, it's got steep approaches from all sides, and on top of all of that, the snow's just started, meaning we've got a small window of opportunity before conditions lock us out altogether." The chief switched off the projector, and after the lights came back on, he motioned toward the men in suits. "This is a joint operation. U.S. Marshals might be taking the lead, but we got FBI for jurisdictional overlap, state troopers for regional support, and Spokane's PD detectives for their work on tying Ridgway to a local safe house that he used last month. We're going in heavy, too. Full tactical long guns, and a chopper on standby for extraction or medevac if it goes sideways. And let me make something clear, gentlemen. Our warrant states apprehend or neutralize. That means dead or alive. Ridgway's not slipping through this time." And at this point, the assistant U.S. attorney chimed in. Legally, you're covered under federal warrant issued out of the Eastern District of Washington, she explained. Murder charges are filed, and the AG's office has greenlit lethal force if he engages. We have probable cause, witness statements, ballistics. He's a clear and present danger, so you're authorized to do what's necessary. Just make sure it's clean. The chief nodded, picking back up where he left off. We'll stage out of Winthrop, the closest town to the wilderness boundary, and we can't risk using air transport, so after we drive out to the forest, it's a 10-mile hump to the base of Osceola, at which point you'll split into teams of 3. Alpha's on point for the summit push, Bravo flanks east to cut off escape routes, Charlie holds the perimeter and provides support if needed. Weather's our clock, meaning we move at first light tomorrow. Any questions? One of the marshals from Seattle spoke up near the back. What happened to those 2 FBI agents? The chief got a nervous look about him. He looked at the assistant U.S. attorney. She gave him a nod, and then he cleared his throat before giving his answer. 2 agents tracked down Ridgway's hideout up in the hills outside of Boise. They contacted the HQ to report a victim up there, and she didn't want to leave. Like, she was scared to? Another marshal asked. Possibly, the chief replied. All we know is that she physically resisted when the 2 agents tried to get her out, which we think set them up to be ambushed. The room stayed silent for a beat, the weight of the task settling in. The chief then asked if anyone had any more questions, and when his query was met with silence, he gave one sharp clap. Good, he said. Gear up, brief your teams, and then go get some rest before tomorrow. I want you all in Winthrop at dawn and ready to go. The next morning, we rolled out at dawn, a convoy of black SUVs and a couple of state trooper trucks cutting through the early morning haze. The drive started at Highway 20. Blacktop was still wet from overnight rain, with the North Cascades looming large ahead of us. And after an hour, our tires ground against loose rock as we turned off onto a gravel service road. The landscape was a mix of wet bark and fallen leaves. The road narrowed fast, hemming us in with dense stands of pine and fir and mud sucking at the wheels as we climbed. At the 20-mile mark, the road ended at a trailhead, just a dirt clearing with a rusted sign. We parked and stepped out onto the half-frozen slush. Osceola Park was visible now, rock-streaked with snow, forming a jagged shadow against the overcast sky. We went over the plan one last time, then the team splits. Alpha gearing up with rifles and packs, Bravo and Charlie doing the same, and then fanning out with radios crackling as the winds bit any exposed skin. And that hike took hours. The trail started flat, this muddy mess through a valley floor littered with downed branches and puddles, but it soon pitched up as switchbacks carved their way upward through the thick timber. The frost grew more pronounced as we climbed, from a dusting to a solid crunching underfoot. Sweat beaded around my temples despite the cold, and our breath puffed out into clouds as the trees thinned near the timberline, giving way to open slopes of shale and ice-crusted grass. Osceola's summit loomed closer, its top shrouded in low clouds, and by midday, we hit the base. Our legs were burning as the peak's steep face stared us down. I think I was too occupied looking upward to notice, because it was a member of my team that first pointed it out to the rest of us, and then once he did, we couldn't look at anything else. At first, when he pointed towards the little white and brown bird lying dead on the ground, I wondered why he'd brought it to my attention. But then I saw another dead bird just a few yards away, and then another, and another, and before long, the whole team was checking out what must have been 24 dead birds and squirrels, all lying at seemingly random spots on the forest floor. They didn't look half-eaten or display any other kinds of damage, nor was there much in the way of decomposition. It was just like they'd dropped down dead. As one of my team started asking what might have killed all those animals, I pulled the radio from my vest, hitting the transmit button as the wind began to pick up. Bravo, this is Alpha Lead. You see anything weird around your position? Over. A beat passed, and the Bravo's voice crackled back, very tense, but they were steady. Alpha, this is Bravo Lead. We got a bunch of dead birds and squirrels. A couple of marmots, too, all over the east flank. No blood on them. It's like they just sort of fell out of the sky. You see anything like that over there? Over. And I glanced at the nearest corpse, still fresh among the frost, and felt a very deep unease settle in my gut. Exact situation here, I said. There's dozens of them, all the way up the west slope. Looks like they died fast, no marks. Any theories? Over. Another pause, but longer this time, and the radio came back. Negative, Alpha. No clue. We flagged it to Charlie, but orders from Chief are to keep pushing. Priority is the summit. Ridgeway's up there, and we're not stopping for this. You good to move? Over. I look back at my team, their confidence draining by the second as their breath clouded in the cold, and the dead stretched all around us, a grim carpet leading toward the shrouded peak. But Bravo was right. We had to keep moving. Roger that, Bravo, I replied. We're good. Moving up now. Keep us posted if Charlie gets anything. Alpha out. I clipped the radio back onto my vest, nodding to the team. Summit's still to play. Eyes sharp, weapons hot. Let's go. We started climbing again, boots crunching through snow and over the small, stiff bodies, the unease settling deeper with every step toward Osceola's Peak. We crested the final rise, boots sinking into a thin crust of snow, and hit the stretch of flat ground that we'd been told of not far from Osceola's summit. The wind eased here, blocked by a low ridge of rock while the clouds hung thick. Ahead of us was the opening to a cave, a jagged gash in the rock about 10 feet wide and half hidden by a slab of granite. It was the only real shelter up there, the obvious spot for Ridgeway to hole up. The other two caves were little more than alcoves. We spread out, rifles raised, moving low and quiet towards the cave's entrance. I signaled to hold positions as shapes emerged from the east. It was Charlie, and Bravo would be close by too. Charlie's team leader and I nodded to one another in acknowledgement, and then we fanned out to cover the cave. We advanced together, this tight semicircle closing in. No noise came from the mouth of the cave. There was just the crunch of our steps and the sound of the wind whistling across the peak. At the entrance, I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as we stepped inside. Charlie's light joined ours, casting shadows against the cave walls. And the cave wasn't deep. It was maybe 30 feet at most, but it narrowed fast. Inside, the air was damp, cold, and smelled of something faintly sour. We advanced carefully, scanning every nook and crevice with our flashlights, and then, about 10 paces in, we saw him. It was Ridgeway, sitting with his back to us at the cave's deepest point, and we couldn't see his face, but we knew it was him. Raymond Ridgeway, U.S. Marshals, lay down with your hands behind your back, I shouted, voice bouncing off the walls. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He simply rocked back and forth, slow and rhythmic, looking like his head was bowed. He was leaner than the photos, but I could see that matted red hair plastered over the back of his head. Charlie's team leader began barking the same sharp, overlapping command as the team's lights remained pinned on the fugitive. Ridgeway, down, now! He yelled while edging closer, but there was still no reaction from this guy. Instead, he just kept rocking back and forth like he couldn't hear us over the noise inside his own head. The deputy to my left, a guy named Torres, moved forward, allowing his rifle to hang from its sling and then reach for Ridgeway's shoulder. Come on, asshole, he said. Let's... But Torres didn't say another word, because the moment he laid a hand on Raymond Ridgeway, his body locked up like he'd been hit with a live wire. He gasped, eyes wide, and then collapsed to the ground hard. I remember watching, in complete shock and horror as his arms jerked in spasms, his boots scraping the dirt as spit foamed near the corner of his mouth. Everyone was frozen, weapons still trained on this guy, yet mere moments after Torres hit the floor, Ridgeway's body suddenly jerked like he'd been jolted awake, and then his head whipped around. His eyes were wild with confusion as they darted between us. More demands for the fugitive's surrender echoed around the cave at that point, but as this guy realized what was happening, he just smiled. Down! Hands behind your back! I snapped, and this time he obeyed, flattening out but with that smile still on his face. We zip-tied him fast, dragging him up as Charlie's medic rushed over to Torres. He was out cold, breathing shallow with his pulse racing. The medic said that it looked like some kind of seizure, but there was a chance that it could be worse. Charlie's chopper was inbound within 20 minutes. Torres got strapped to a stretcher, still unconscious, and was lifted out with the medic, and Ridgeway went next. He was cuffed and just staring blankly as we loaded him up, but still, he looked like he was smiling. We cleared the cave, and the job was done. But the dead birds and the spasms, the unanswered questions hung over us as we hiked back down those slopes. We linked up with the other teams and debriefed at Winthrop by nightfall, and we had questions, but the dead animals took a back seat to Tora's condition. We were told the medics had to put him in a coma to stop the seizures, and he didn't wake up for a week, but when he did, he remembered nothing. Last thing in his head was driving out to Pasayten, and the whole raid had been wiped clean from his memory. Ridgway was in custody, locked up in pending trial, but he refused to talk. He just sat there in his cell, rocking back and forth, just like he'd done up in that cave. And after the raid, the dead birds and Torres's collapse gradually faded into the background noise of the case. The warrant execution report barely mentioned the birds, and they were relegated to a single line buried in the details. Numerous deceased wildlife observed near suspect's location, likely killed for food. Investigators shrugged it off. They said Ridgway must have been hunting them. No one bothered to test the bodies for toxins or disease, and there were no autopsies or samples. It was all too much hassle for a side note, and with Ridgway in cuffs, the focus shifted to building a murder case against him. The birds stayed where they fell, rotting on Osceola Peak, completely forgotten. And Torres' seizures got a similar brush-off. The medical report called it a sudden neurological event, either an epileptic fit or a stress-induced collapse. Doctors chalked it up to a 1 in a million fluke that just so happened to hit when he touched Ridgway. Coincidence, they insisted, nothing more. No link to the cave, the birds, or anything else up there. Torres woke up from his coma after a week with no memory of anything, as I said, and the service gave him desk duty for a while and then he transferred out, and we never heard from him again. Nothing that strange ever crossed my path after that. I definitely went through way worse things, be they shootouts, ambushes, or fugitives who fought to the bitter and bloody end, but nothing which had that same eerie edge to it. No unexplained dead animals piling up, no one dropping into spasms for no reason, just the usual controlled chaos of the job. I've had a long time to process what happened too, almost 40 years in fact, but still, it just gnaws at me. The dead birds, Torres' so-called medical event, Ridgway rocking like he was somewhere else, none of it adds up, and no one seemed to care enough to make it make sense. I've run it over in my head 100 times, the sour smell in that cave, the way those critters just dropped. I know I should just let it go, but leaving it all unexplained feels like leaving a loaded gun on the table. I don't buy the easy answers. Sustenance, coincidence. Something was off up there and I'll never know what. And that's the part that sticks with me. The loose end that I can't seem to shake, and why that whole thing became one of the most significant incidents of my whole career. It made me realize that the same agencies that protect us from dangerous people also protect us from dangerous truths. My name's Cal. I'm a longtime listener and I'm a forestry technician at the Tongass National Forest up in Alaska. I've been out here for 6 years now, and let me tell you, it's made for one heck of a place to work. It's beautiful, brutal, generous, and unforgiving all at the same time, but it's also the only place I've ever experienced genuine, debilitating terror. I didn't set out to be a forestry tech, not originally, but having grown up in northern Minnesota, I spent most of my spare time outdoors, either fishing or hiking with my dad. He was a logger, and we had the woods right there on our doorstep, so from a very early age I learned stuff like how to spot a healthy tree from a sick one, how to listen to the wind, or how to know when a storm was coming. I liked the quiet of it, how walking in the woods always felt like an adventure, and I always thought it'd be the coolest thing in the world to have a job where that's all you ever did. And after high school I bounced around poorly paying jobs, but all they did was make me realize that I wanted something which kept me outside, away from cities and noise. I went to community college, got an associate's degree in natural resources, and then landed a seasonal gig with the U.S. Forest Service in Minnesota. Alaska wasn't part of the plan until a buddy from that first job told me about openings in the Tongass. He said it was a great deal. Remote, rugged, nothing like the tame forest back home. So I applied, and then when I got the offer, I packed my truck and drove up through Canada. It took me 5 days to reach Ketchikan, where I caught a float plane to my first posting, and then after seeing the place from the air, I was hooked. The scale of the Tongass blew me away. It's 17 million acres of mountains and temperate rainforest, bigger than some U.S. states even. I signed on full-time after that first season, and even after the experience I'm about to tell you, I still don't regret coming here. Not entirely, anyway. Out here, it's just you and the trees, All the spruce, hemlock, cedar, all stretching up 100 feet or more. It's my job to monitor timber stands, check for disease, mark trees for harvest, and sometimes just walk the trails to make sure everything's holding together. I've got a little cabin near the ranger station. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. And then after a day in the field, I'll sit on the porch with a beer and watch the mist just roll in off the water. It's a good life, with a kind of peace that you can't find anywhere else. What I hate, though, is the weather. It rains around 200 days a year in the Tongass, and not just a little light drizzle either. The drops come down in sheets, cold and relentless, meaning that you're almost constantly soaked through during the wetter months, no matter how waterproof your gear claims to be. And winters are worse. Short days, long nights, and the wind absolutely cuts you. But then there's also the isolation. I don't mind being alone, but weeks can go by without seeing another person, and that wears on you. The nearest town's a boat ride away, and even then, it's just a handful of stores and one bar. Sometimes I'll catch myself talking to myself just to hear a voice, and as much as that concerns me, the isolation isn't even close to the worst part of being out here. It was late August of last year, and although the days were starting to shrink, it was still light out past 8 p.m. I was out on a routine survey around 12 miles north of the ranger station, deep in a section of old-growth forest that hadn't seen any logging in years. The terrain up there can get real tough, with steep slopes, thick underbrush, and streams cutting through just about everywhere, which makes the ground incredibly uneven. I've been out since dawn, marking trees and taking soil samples, and I was exhausted. My pack was heavy with gear and my boots were caked with mud, so I figured that I'd finish up by a little creek that I knew, where I could eat a sandwich, wash off my boots, and then head back to the station before dark. I remember sitting on a fallen log by the creek, unwrapping my food with my head in the clouds when a sudden sound brought me straight back down to earth. At first I thought it was a bear, and as much as they can be a threat, you get used to them out there. They're mostly black bears, sometimes browns, and they tend to move quiet and not bother anyone unless they're startled. But this wasn't quiet. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, like something massive pushing through the woods. Whole branches sounded like they were snapping, very thick ones too, not just twigs. And I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth, and just listened. The noise was coming from maybe 50 yards upstream, hidden by a cluster of spruce and ferns, and I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it clear as day. Something crunching and thudding, moving slow but steady. I roughly rewrapped my sandwich and grabbed my bear spray as fast as I could, planning on scaring it off if it got too close. Bears usually bolt when you yell, so the first thing I did was stand up and shout, "You didn't smell me yet, Mama Bear." But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder and closer, and I very quickly realized this wasn't a bear. I've heard bears move, dozens of them over the years, but this was different. It was deeper, heavier, and the rhythm was off too. It wasn't the rolling gait of a four-legged animal. It was more like something upright, something that didn't care about being quiet. When the thought occurred to me that I wasn't dealing with your average bear, I remember how my stomach dropped. I backed up a step, scanning the woods. Now the creek was gurgling behind me and the ground was moving beneath my feet, but all I could focus on was that sound, this snap thud, snap thud. It was maybe 70 yards away now, still out of sight, so I yelled again, louder that time, saying, "Hey, get the hell out of here." I didn't get anything in response. No growl, no huff, no sign it even heard me, just that steady, unstoppable movement. My heart was thumping in my chest and my hands were shaking so bad that I almost dropped the spray. I've been around wild animals my whole career. Moose, wolves, even a pissed-off mountain lion once in Minnesota, but nothing ever felt like that. And then, the smell hit me. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. No bear musk, no wet fur, not even rot. It was sharp, almost metallic, mixed with something sour, like sweat gone bad. And when it rolled over me with the breeze, I gagged. And that's when the panic started to really rise in my chest. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was big. Too big. A moose might snap branches, but they're clumsy. They're loud in a different way. This sounded almost controlled. I grabbed my pack and started backing down the trail, keeping my eyes on the trees upstream, and the noise kept coming. Closer now, maybe 30 to 40 yards at the most. I couldn't tell if it was following me or just moving parallel, but it didn't stop. And so I turned and ran. I'm not proud of it, but I bolted down that trail like a kid scared of the dark, and I didn't stop until I'd put a good half-mile between me and the creek. When I finally slowed, gasping for air, the sound was gone. No snaps or thuds, just the usual hum of the forest. I stood there, bent over with my hands on my knees trying to make sense of everything. What the hell was that? It wasn't a bear. Too big and too steady. A person, maybe. But that's not a chance. Not out there, not that deep. I'd have seen tracks, heard a voice or something. But there was nothing but that noise and that smell. I made it back to that station after dark, rattled and soaked with sweat, and I tried to calm myself down, but I could only do so before my mind started racing again. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin had me sitting up and listening, and then as I tried to go back to sleep, I kept replaying what had happened in my head, trying to figure out what I'd heard. The size of it didn't add up. Bears don't move like that, like I said. And by morning, I was half convinced I'd imagined everything. Maybe I'd been out too long, gotten dehydrated, and just let my mind play tricks. But I could still hear those snaps and feel that faint tremor in the ground. It was real. I knew it. A couple of days later, I told Jim, one of the other techs. He's been in the Tongass way longer than me, a grizzled veteran who's seen it all. Storms, bear attacks, lost hikers, you name it, Jim's got the t-shirt. We were at the station, splitting wood for the stove, and I just blurted out, "I heard something out there, Jim. Something big. Bigger than it should have been." And I told him the whole story. The sound, the smell, how it didn't seem to react to anything I yelled. He listened, quiet at first, chopping away at his logs, and when I finished, he set the axe down and turned to me with a very stern look on his face. And it wasn't just disbelief or curiosity. It was almost pity, mixed with something nervous, like he thought I was losing it. He asked if I was sure that I wasn't hearing things, and said long days did that to a man. I said maybe, but I could tell he didn't buy it. He kept glancing at me after that, like he was waiting for me to crack. I forced a laugh and then told him maybe I was just overtired. He nodded, but the look didn't go away. And that's when I decided to shut up about it. No point in making people think that I'm nuts. And I tried telling myself that it was nothing. Overwork, imagination, whatever. But I can't lie to myself. I just can't. I haven't gone anywhere near that creek since. I stick to the trails closer to the station now, and it's just easier that way. The job's still the same. The rain, the trees, the endless quiet, but something's different now. I catch myself listening harder, waiting to hear that sound again, and I haven't heard it since, and I hope I never do. But obviously I'll never forget it either. Whatever it was, I think that it's still out there moving through those woods, and although I can't stop myself from thinking about it, I'm not sure I want to know what it is. So this was the late summer in 1992, and I'd convinced my girlfriend Sarah to join me for a hike through the wilderness area up near Mount Rainier. We'd been dating for about a year, and she wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but she humored me. And the plan was simple. A day hike, maybe a 6 or 7 mile round trip, through a dense stretch of forest that I'd read about in a guidebook. We packed light, just water, a couple of sandwiches, and a map, and then hit the trail just after sunrise. It started off easy, a dirt path cutting through towering trees. The air was cool and the sky was clear, and the forest was quiet except for us walking and the occasional chirp of a bird. We didn't talk much at first, just walked side by side, setting into the rhythm of it. And about an hour in, the trail got rougher. It narrowed, winding deeper into the woods where the trees grew closer together, and we crossed a small creek, stepping on slick stones to keep our feet dry, and I held Sarah's hand to steady her. She laughed when she almost slipped, a quick, nervous sound that we joked about afterwards, and it was a huge relief to see her start to enjoy herself. Then, around noon, we stopped for a break, sitting on a fallen log to eat our sandwiches. After lunch, the trail climbed this very gentle slope and the woods opened up a little bit with fewer trees and more underbrush. We'd been walking maybe 3 or 4 hours total when Sarah started lagging behind. I slowed down, waiting for her to catch up. She gave me this kind of defiant look, like she wouldn't admit that she was tired, and I just smiled and told her that we'd turn back, and then, seconds later, she saw it. We were maybe 10 yards apart, me up ahead, her trailing behind when she stopped dead. I didn't notice at first, but just kept walking, and then I heard her voice, sharp and low, barely above a whisper. Oh my God. I turned around, afraid that I was about to see her pointing at a bear or maybe a snake or something, because she was frozen, staring off to her left with the color having drained from her face. I followed her gaze, and my jaw dropped. There, about 20 feet off the trail, was a tree. It was a big one, maybe 3 feet thick, and halfway up its trunk, at around chest height, was a deer. It wasn't just any deer either. It was a full-grown buck, antlers and all, and its body was just stuck in the tree. The front half hung out one side, head kind of hanging down, eyes glassy and just blank, while the back half stuck out the other side, its hind legs dangling limp. And just to make this 100% clear, it wasn't hanging from a branch or caught in a fork. It was inside the tree, like embedded in it, almost like the trunk had grown around it. I took a step closer, but Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it hurt a little. "What the hell is that?" she said, her voice shaky. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The tree definitely wasn't broken in any way, and there was no splintered bark, no jagged edges where the deer's body met the trunk, and the wood looked smooth, untouched and natural, like it had grown that way. But that was impossible. Trees don't grow around something that fast, and this deer wasn't some ancient skeleton. It looked fresh, barely starting to rot. There were a couple of flies buzzing around its head, but that was it. No stench, no maggots. There was no blood, no torn flesh, nothing to suggest violence. It was just there, almost fused with the wood in a way that made exactly 0 sense to me and Sarah. Sarah stayed there where she was. Her grip was tightening around my arm. "I don't like this," she said. But I felt this pull, this need to figure this out. I took another step, then another, until I was close enough to touch the tree if I wanted, and something about it made my skin crawl, even as my brain kept prodding at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the deer had fallen from somewhere high up and landed just right, but there were no cliffs nearby, no broken branches above, and the trunk was too solid, too intact. I crouched down, peering up at where the deer's body met the wood. The bark flowed around it seamlessly, like the tree had molded itself to the shape of the carcass. I reached out and hesitated and then brushed my fingers against the trunk just below the deer. It felt normal. There was nothing strange until you looked up and saw that impossible thing sticking out of it. Sarah yelled my name, telling me to get back, but I couldn't stop myself. I stood up and walked around to the other side. There, the deer's hindquarters hung limp, and I saw the same thing there too. No blood, no damage to its hide, no sign whatsoever of how it got that way. And that's when curiosity started to turn to fear. My stomach tightened, not from nausea, but from something deeper, something I still can't put into words. It wasn't just weird anymore, it felt very wrong. The woods felt quiet too, like everything had just stopped and started watching us. No birds or wind, just the sound of my own breathing and Sarah's quick, shallow gasp behind me. I looked at her, and her eyes were wide and her lips were pressed very tightly. "We need to go," she said. And at that point I didn't argue. I could remove myself physically, but mentally I couldn't pull away from this. How long had it been up there? Had someone or something put it there? The unease crept up my spine, slow at first and then all at once, like a cold hand closing around my neck. I thought about pictures I'd seen of animals caught in fences or traps, but this wasn't that. This was deliberate, unnatural, and the more I looked, the more I felt like we weren't supposed to see it. Neither of us looked back, but I didn't need to. I could still see it, just burned into my brain. We moved in silence, our steps quick and uneven as my heart was pounding, not from the pace, but from thoughts of what we'd just seen. Sarah kept her head down, and I knew she felt it too. That shift from curiosity to dread, the sense that we'd stumbled onto something that we weren't built to understand. We made it back to my car in almost half the time that it took to hike out, and the whole drive home we didn't say a word to each other. And when we got to her place, she looked at me and her face was still pale, saying, "We're not talking about this ever again." And I agreed. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't want to upset her any more than she already was. And we never did mention it, not to each other and not to anyone. But there are definitely times late at night that I'll see that deer in my mind, half in and half out of that tree, and feel that same cold grip around my neck, reminding me that was all real. Last year, I took a trip into the MSD wilderness here in Florida, which is way out in the Everglades. It was late July, and I'd been hiking for hours alone with my thoughts. I'd done a bunch of hikes like that before, and it was my way of unplugging. Then, after a while, I began to hear something. It started as a low hum somewhere off to my left, like the drone of a distant lawnmower. Insects are obviously very common out there, but what I'd heard that day was different. I stopped trying to place it, and the sound grew. This steady thrum that felt like it was vibrating in my chest. I looked around the trees and the bushes and the empty sky, but there was just the noise, getting louder and louder as it got closer and closer, until eventually it felt like it was right on top of me. Suddenly, I saw it. It was a beetle, one that looked as big as a football, as it broke from the tree line and then started flying in circles above my head. I remember freezing on the spot, moving my neck around as I stared at it, and how the chattery buzzing noise it made sounded like a hornet's, only way deeper and way creepier. And I'd seen plenty of crazy-looking bugs in my years hiking, gnarly-looking stag beetles and cicadas, and even those nasty-ass giant horseflies whose bites hurt like hell, but nothing like that beetle thing. Its body looked like a very dark green with a slight sheen to it, and it was segmented and hard-looking too, with hooked legs that dangled beneath it. It looked like it shouldn't have been able to fly, not at that size. Yet there it was, circling me 10 feet up. I wasn't scared, not yet. I was surprised, but I dealt with wildlife before, bears and snakes and even mountain lions from time to time. Weird as it was, this was just a bug, right? Nothing I couldn't handle with some spray in the bottom of my boot. I adjusted my pack and started walking again, figuring that it'd buzz off, but it didn't. Instead, the sound shifted, dropping lower, and then when I glanced up, I saw the beetle was descending. It came down fast, stopped a foot from my face, wings still pounding the air as its eyes locked onto mine. They were huge, black, glossy orbs that took up half its head, and somehow, they scared the crap out of me. They weren't like any insect I'd ever seen before. These were smooth, deep, and wet-looking, like pools of ink, and they watched me. Not just reactively, not just instinctually. There was something intelligent behind them, something that knew that I was there. Even in the Florida heat, my blood turned to ice and I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. And for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the beetle hovered in front of me. And then, with a flick of its wings, it just darts away and vanished into the trees. I stood there. My heart was pounding in my chest and I was sweating. My hands shook as I wiped my face and tried to shake the image of those eyes. I told myself it was nothing to worry about and kept moving, but the hike didn't feel relaxing anymore. I didn't hear the buzzing again, but I couldn't stop listening for it. And by late afternoon, I found a spot to camp. I set up my hammock, pulled some food from my pack, and tried to eat. And I should have been hungry by then, but I had no appetite. My mind kept replaying the beetle, its eyes and the way it looked at me, and I crawled into my hammock early, hoping a nap might reset me, but it didn't. The dreams came fast. I was back on the trail, but it was dark and the buzzing was everywhere. Above me, behind me, inside my head, I couldn't see the beetle, but I knew that it was there. And then its eyes appeared, floating in the darkness even bigger than before. They were unblinking and endless, pulling me in, and as I started to drown in them, I grasped at my throat. I woke up gasping and almost fell out of my hammock. The darkness was buzzing with the night song of the Everglades, and I just laid there, listening intently until the sun finally rose. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up fast. The plan had been to stay another day and loop back through a different trail, but I needed out. The hike back to my car was 6 miles, and I set a brutal pace, barely even stopping to drink. On the whole way, I kept my head on a swivel, ears straining. My legs were burning and my pack was digging into my shoulders, but I didn't slow down, and everything just sounded like wings to me at that point. The parking lot came into view around noon, and my beaten-up sedan was the only car there. I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors before I even caught my breath. The drive home was just absolutely insane. 2 hours of winding roads, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and I just kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that beetle flying and staring at me behind me. And I knew how irrational that was. I just couldn't stop myself. And when I got home, I dumped my pack in the garage and went straight to the shower, letting the hot water blast away the sweat and dirt. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was experiencing some kind of late-onset entomophobia, which is the fear of insects, and although that beetle had seemed like it was big as a goddamn football, it was probably much smaller. But that night, lying in bed, I kept seeing those eyes, black and bottomless, knowing almost. I got up and grabbed my laptop and started searching. Big beetles, wilderness insects, anything that matched what I'd seen, but nothing fit. The closest were some oversized species from South America, but that didn't have those eyes, that same presence. Days passed, and then weeks, and I didn't say a word to anyone about it. Not my buddies who hike, not my nerdy sister who might actually want to help. I was scared that they'd think that I was crazy. And I just stopped hiking there altogether. The gear's still in the garage, just gathering dust. I stick to the city now. The only bugs are cockroaches, and the only buzzing is traffic. And I never thought that I'd ever say this in a million years, but now, I actually feel safer here. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.